Good afternoon, everybody. Online and in the room, welcome to the next CLEA seminar. Today, we have with us Michel Bauwens, and I was thinking, like, you are a funnily paradoxical person in a sense, like in my understanding, because like if you think about the paradigm of peer-to-peer decentralization, collective intelligence, however you call it, like mutuality. You have a word for it. I noticed. It's a very distributed phenomenon, yes, or idea for distributedness, and yet even such ideas have their prophets who are kind of like singularly embodied, and I see you as such person, yes. So somebody has to speak this song. Yeah, so it seems to me that that your voice is like the voice that narrates the story. So welcome, and it's a little bit funny to say welcome at the VUB, since it turns out you are more from here than I am. So like just hello, Michel, and please, the floor is yours.
No pictures today. All right. Yes. So I'm Belgian, so I'm from here, but I also studied here a long time ago. I finished in '81 political science, and 20 years ago I moved to Thailand. So I'm not from here anymore. It's the first time I came back since COVID. But I'm very happy. I put this on. Sorry for that. Yeah. Yes, so I guess what I like to do today is give you a kind of narrative of the research of the P2P Foundation over time and what we are doing now. Now, if I say we, it's also me. It's sometimes hard to know, in a collective who does what. So until 2018, we were very active. And now it's a bit dormant, but all the people involved in network still doing, this kind of work. All right. So maybe just quickly define what our purpose is. What is it that we look at? So two things: peer-to-peer and the commons, right? So peer-to-peer, what we mean is the capacity we now have for trans-local self-organizing. So creating networks where you have permissionless contributions that are relatively independent of the place where you are. So the capacity not just to organize geographic entities and local groups, but to actually create, affinity-based translocal entities, right? So that's what we mean by peer-to-peer. So any system where any individual can permissionlessly contribute. And then usually the way it works is you have a second layer, the maintainers, the editors, and they don't have the power to command, but they have the power to say no. So the difference is, so I would say normally, like if you want to be a journalist, you need to be hired. And often you need, say, do this, do that, right? Here, everybody can actually write the article in they wanted, like in the Wikipedia, but you have editors that say, no, this is not good enough. Yes, yes. So it's no longer command and control, but it's still control to a certain degree. And there's various mechanisms to either elect or self-filter those maintainers. And, sometimes it works very well. Like in open source, I think it works pretty well because the people who get to these positions are like really the experts and with a kind of more systemic view. But then, for example, in Wikipedia, it's the people who know the rules and do not know the subjects. And so there you have people who know less about the subject. So it doesn't always work optimally, right? But it does basically the basic model that you will find. So then the second concept we work with, of course, the commons. So we use kind of like a post-Ostrom definition, like David Bollier uses it, and we use it too. So it's a shared resource that is maintained or created or protected by a community or a group of stakeholders using their own regulations. So those are kind of three things we look at. So it is a thing for us. So we don't use common without an S. We stress it. It has to be something. It can be immaterial, but it has to be concrete. It's not just the opposite of neoliberalism, some vague, metaphysical principle. It's actually something that is in some way concrete and that people can contribute to. I would also say we stress nowadays more that it's a choice. So maybe 15 years ago, they would have this theory that only certain goods would be appropriate for commoning, right? It had to be non-rival and non-excludable. I think now pretty much everybody in at least in our environment says, no, you can have a car sharing commons. So commons is just another way of conceiving property relations, governance relations in a certain domain. It doesn't have to be non-scarce or scarce, rival, non-rival. It's a decision to mutualize. That's actually what I believe. So the decision to mutualize something, that is what commons are. And then, of course, a self-regulation distinguishes it very clearly from state or market, which doesn't mean, again, that they don't have relations with each other. So to take a typical example, so Senegambia, there's all these fishing communities. They make agreements for fishing, like who can fish when and how much. But once they fished it, they can sell it to the market, right? So the commons is not necessarily like a pure thing that is completely cut off from the market. It can, but it doesn't have to. But at least in the core, it has to have these different rules. Maybe very quickly, so we use the relational grammar of Alan Page Fisk. So he distinguishes in the book Structures of Social Life 4 different modes of exchange of dealing with value. So, and I actually will tell them in the way they kind of emerge historically according to certain authors. So what he calls communal shareholding is what we call the commons. So basically an exchange between an individual and a group and a whole thing. So the hunter or the gatherer comes back. He doesn't sell it. He doesn't give it for to get something back. He shares it with his family, with his clan, with his tribe, whatever that totality is. So the open source software coder who produces for Linux, there's nobody in Linux that owes him anything directly, but through his self-interest or interest in co-constructing Linux, he gets to benefit from the whole at the same time, right? So it's like some holistic thing that is that you exchange with, right? And that is so what he calls equality matching is, I don't know where the noise comes from. So what he calls equality matching is what we call the gift economy. That's slightly different because, so like in a potlatch, for example, or, in Polynesia, or even where I live in Thailand, so people give gifts that creates a debt in some way. So once I get a gift from you, I owe you something, right? And the way that is theorized in some anthropology is that, so communal shareholding is as long as you have tribal bands, but once you have more complex villages, the way to make peace is through gifting, right? You create social relationships and mutual debts in a way. So it's unlike the market exchange, it's not like tit for tat immediately, but there is something that needs to be given back, right? And that's so paradoxical why he calls it equality matching, because the gift economy creates inequality, right? Okay, then the third one, he calls it authority ranking. And then again, you could say historically, once you have, let's say, domination or conquest, obviously, commoning and the gift economy are not very useful, but then it's more like some kind of take and redistribute, right? Authority ranking means we'll protect you, and that deserves something, and you'll make things that deserve something. You make food, And so you start ranking basically what you get in society according to some kind of status, like by birth, in feudalism, by PhD in the university. So, you have authority ranking according to some kind of status marker. And then the fourth, we all know because we live in it, market pricing, where the basically how much you have determines your social power. Okay, so if you're interested in the historicizing part of it, I recommend Kojin Karatani, The Structure of World History. He calls it slightly different. He says mode A, mode B, mode C, and mode D. And so if you read Alan Page Fisk, it's kind of, how could you call it, synchronicity? Like it's across any time period, you can find all four all the time. But what Karitani does is he says, well, at some periods in some systems, this mode of exchange dominated and kind of changed the other ones, but they still are there, right? So for example, think about dating today, it's marketized, right? You have to go on an app, maybe pay for the app. So you're still dating, but the market paradigm has kind of really, give it a certain color because it's a dominant mode of exchange. And so note that Kojin Karatani, what he does is, he abandons mode of production as the prime mover and he focuses on mode of exchange. And this is what we did 20 years ago in the P2P Foundation. We focused on the values that kind of emerge from this peer-to-peer mode of being and exchanging, and how does that work? Like, what are these people thinking, doing? So you will find wiki.p2pfoundation, p2pfoundation.net. So what we do is monitoring peer-to-peer and the commons and its effect in all domains of human life, right? Whether it's transport or housing. Yes, go ahead.
Yes, just a question about, so maybe more the logic of Karatani was?
Yes,
Yeah.
Kojin Karatani. I think in Japan it's Karatani Kojin, but yeah.
So I thought the invention of money was a great invention to bypass to have basically larger human groups, because with the gift economy you need to remember with your human memory who gave what to whom, so that there is some kind of distributed control. But if you have 100, 200 people, it's impossible to remember, and that money is a way to solve this. But I don't see how you can have this with authority ranking. You're still in a kind of
yes. So there's a lot of debate, of course. What comes first, right? But I'm more of the school that believes that states come first and make markets possible because they create the security and the scale. So the way I see it could be wrong, but from reading quite a bit of literature is, so once you have agricultural surplus, so you see like Minoa and the Harappan civilization, they don't have defensive measures, right? They don't have like high walls, or there's no sign that they needed to defend themselves, right? So then there is hypothesis that some climate event happened, and then that the people from the Central Asian steppe started saying, well, we're starving and these guys have all the fun. So that moment you get civilization in a way. So you get fortified cities, you get an elite, and the elite needs status. And so that's the theory that they create the market. So the market starts with luxury goods like spices and certain clothing, and it starts in these cities for the elites of these cities, right? But that is because the city already exists as an institution, as a kind of proto-state institution, which has an army which is separate from the people, right? So you could say in a very broad generalization that as long as you have kinship, you have commoning and gift economy in various combinations. Once you have civilization, you have markets and states. And then indeed, I think it's scaling. And so where the current P2P comes in is that it scales again gifting and commoning, and that is new, right? So so gifting and commoning stayed very current if you had small communities, but the coordination and transaction and communication costs to do that didn't allow you to scale, right? It was so, Geoffrey West would call it a sublinear relationship, right? And cities, he claims, are superlinear. So when you scale cities, you get more of everything, more than so you double the size of a city, you have more than double the innovation, right? So that's his explanation why in evolutionary terms, cities tend to displace other forms. And then usually what happens, this is another thesis from, I'm a bit anticipating because I was going to talk a bit about macro historians, but a lot of macro historians would say that, it starts with decentralized cities, like the Italian city-states, the polis in the Hellenic civilization. Then they coalesce, they fight, they exhaust themselves. And that's when you have some kind of semi-periphery or periphery barbarians, relative barbarians to the civilization that then take over. And that creates then the second phase, which is the imperial phase, right? And so Spengler would say you have 500 years of decentralized, and then you have 500 years of imperial. And it pretty much fits but it depends, when you start counting. So for example, Spengler starts counting, he says European civilization started only in 998, right? That's when it consolidated itself, and that's when it really starts as a kind of synthesis between the Germanic and the Latin spheres. Okay, so very quickly, maybe the language that we speak or what we studied in the P2P Foundation based on these kind of like relational grammars. So we speak about peer production, meaning like any coalescing of these people who permissionally contribute to some common endeavor. That's what we call peer production. And so the logic of peer production, which we link to peer governance and peer property, is once you are in a logic where people can freely enter this common space and you don't have direct dependency, then simply authority ranking doesn't work. Because I'm not necessarily paying you, even though we're both working on Linux, you have maybe 300 companies, but you also have 25% of Linux contributors who belong to no company at all, and they're also contributing, and some of them get paid, some of them don't get paid. And so this whole network thing, right, is different from what we knew before. So nowadays we tend to call this fourth sector organizations. So state, private, non-profit being the first three, right? And they're being embedded in a commons-based network, right? So a network which has its own common infrastructures, which are then either commonly governed or commonly owned, and make the cooperation of all these players possible, right? So, okay, I'm anticipating a little bit, but for example, in crypto, anybody can enter crypto. You don't have to be a company. You can be a company, but you don't have to be the only thing you need is a token. If you have a token, you can get in, and everybody who contributes to the network gets tokens, right? So here you are in a kind of meta integrative infrastructure, right? Because it can incorporate market functions, state functions, non-profit functions in a kind of higher level of coordination, right? And yes, go ahead.
So maybe that's not the right classification to say that it's a fourth kind, because it's kind of, you can do decentralized, you could apply these decentralized principles to any to states, to private, to non-profits.
Yes, I mean, that is also happening, right? You have network markets, network states, you have pure networks. But when it does what I'm saying it does, then it actually does integrate the others. So if you take, for example, a crypto network, you have coders, and they contribute to a commons and an open source code base. Then you have people who buy the currencies in the hope that, you know, the project will be successful and that their token value will be higher at the end. And they're doing markets, right? And they coexist. So Ostrom would say it's polycentric, right? And again, polycentricity has always existed, but the argument that we are making is it's scaling up. That we now can scale polycentricity, and that we can create these new types of networks. Yeah, go ahead.
How would you see this be applied to sustainable development, where there are many different goals?
Right.
That could be kind of be seen as some commons of sustainability.
Yes.
So I was wondering if you could elaborate.
So we have publications on this topic. So I'll just briefly mention them. One is called the Thermodynamics of Peer Production. It's a 2-volume work. And so our argument is the following, that when you mutualize, you can substantially bring down thermodynamic costs. For example, a genuine mutualization of cars. So we're not talking about Uber. Uber is a competitive system which make the drivers drive around to be at the right place at the right moment. And studies show that they use more petrol than before. So that's not what we mean. But in Ghent, for example, here in Belgium, you have Dégage, you have another one, Partago. So these are like neighborhood-based car sharing associations. And in those types of real commons or cooperative arrangements, every shared car replaces 9 to 13 private cars. So the rule, as far as I can remember, so cars are used 5% of the time, right? So if you have 10%, so you have a 100% buffer, then you actually have enough cars to have everybody who needs a car particular moment, there'll be a car. So you know, I don't know how that works mathematically, but you know, I'm assuming it works because they're growing and they get more and more members, and so people are presumably happy with that. Yes. Peer production, thermodynamics of peer production. And so there is a person you might know, John Takara, the design school, I can forgot the name, but he has this project called Factor 20 Reduction. And he has a number of examples. For example, a German city where they combined electric vans with cargo bikes for the same volume of commercial transport, and they saved 95% of energy, right? Not matter because they have the same amount of, but in this case, it's only energy. But so my argument, so this is an answer to your question, is that mutualization is key, and that's never debated. But we believe mutualization is the key to sustainability. Doing more with less. So when you bundle a property, that becomes usufruct, right? Not everybody needs a car, but you put the car in usufruct. I don't know how to say it in English, but usufruit, yeah, right? Then you have a pool that anybody can use, and then so you don't need to buy one for everybody, right? Okay, I'll make a little side story here. So I have another theory, which is called the pulsation of the commons. Yes, yes.
That I wanted to go to the airport, and then I Googled basically the distance between basically Etterbeek to the airport, and I saw that in the Google it kind of offered me multiple routes, and some of them included actually taking, for example, a scooter with my bag, which I wouldn't. But then it bundled up many solutions together that not only showed basically how I reduce CO2,
Yeah,
but also the time. So I'm thinking that maybe this kind of like bundling would be some sort of like smart way of pushing people towards offering better behavior.
I think this is already happening. So I think in Finland and other places, they already have these cards, you know, like the Oyster card in London, but that can be used for all of these things at the same time, right? So that I think is a really interesting way to think about it, which is, yeah, yes, bundling those things. But the way we think about it is, so I did a study for the city of Ghent about this, right? We mapped the commons, the urban commons in Ghent, and we saw that in 2008 there were 50 urban commons projects, and in 2016 there were 500. So the reaction to the crisis, to people not having access to, you know, buying houses, even renting becomes an issue nowadays, is actually mutualization. So people are doing that bottom up. And so we also have a report which is called Mutualizing Urban Provisioning Systems, where we looked, but you know, it's 5 years old now, 6 years old, where we looked at all the urban policies that do this. And it's a lot more than you think. Like, we're not aware of all the things that are happening at the local level. But for example, the most famous one is the Bologna regulation for the care and regeneration of the urban commons. So basically you have a commons lab in the city, and any group of people can say, oh, we want to take care of this resource. You know, a square that doesn't look good anymore, or a factory which has been abandoned for 10 years, or why is our river not clean? You know, so people who are motivated can say, we want to take care of this. So then there is a negotiation with the city, and that's called a commons accord. And then the city is the director of coordination, and this is called the quintuple helix approach. So you have the city, the commercial sector, the non-profit sector, and the research sector, so 4, which help the 5th, which are the commons-centric citizen initiatives. This policy has been taken over. Again, this is old news before COVID. 250 cities copied it, and 1 million Italians are now involved in this type of activity, like cleaning the Tiber, you know, making the street better. And so, you know, Ostrom actually says that, right? She says commons cannot survive if they don't have an agreement with public authorities, because then the police can come. So it has to be recognized by the legal system in order to survive. And of course, that was the case in the Middle Ages. The commons were a vital part of a feudal society. So if you were a farmer, you had your own plot of land for your family. You had to work on the Lord's land in exchange for his protection, theoretically, but probably also really. And then the third thing was they had a commons, where they had agreements, you know, which family could go in and take what at what, and then every year they had this procession called the Rogentide procession, where they would go around the village, the whole parish, and they would reconfirm their commons. And so it's called beating the bounds, because they would put these white milestones to say, this is from us. So it was a very strong identity marker before the advent of capitalism. And the Reformation basically killed that. But before that, it was, so only capitalism has been enclosing. As much as we may dislike pre-capitalist feudalism, or you know, these kind of militaristic societies, they actually composed with the commons. That was really like the social contract. So I come to, so maybe one more thing about sustainability. So we have another report called P2P Accounting for Planetary Survival. And we looked at 300 peer production communities. That was already done before, but we were in a coalition called P2P Value. You might look into that, P2P Value. So here's the thing. 75% of these communities already had contributory accounting mechanisms. So what does it mean? Is that you recognize contributions that are not market facing, right? So you have the market facing, that's not a problem, because you get paid and you get money. But the people who work at the core of these commons, like in Linux, they don't get paid very well, or not at all, depending on the context. But so by recognizing as a network that these people are vital to your survival, because they solve the collective action problem, they do the common infrastructure that we all need, but we don't want to pay, you know, as an individual, we don't want to pay for this, right? but the network does it in some way. So that you can do through contributory accounting. Then the second thing is flow accounting. Flow accounting is, for example, something called REA, resources, events, agents. So this is post-capitalist, not double entry, no double entry accounting that every transaction shows you where you are in the network. So which resource are we talking about? What are the agents doing it? And what is the event, the agreement, the contract that is involved? And everybody can see it, right? So this is, in my view, a big anthropological revolution. So accounting is invented in Sumer, like the beginning of the civilizational model with the state, the temples that get the grain. It takes 1,000 years to use writing to actually express words. So the alphabet was invented not for talking, but for counting originally, right? It took 1,000 years for somebody to say something beautiful with the thing. And then in the 15th or 14th century, you have Lucio Pacioli, a Franciscan monk who mixes a bit of Arabic accounting and so he makes a new synthesis, and that creates double entry book accounting, which really creates and facilitates capitalism. And so I claim today, if we invent post-capitalist accounting without double entry in an open holoptic system that can mutually coordinate the whole network, that we have entered already in something new. That is no longer capitalism. And then you can add to that we now have programmable currencies, right? So we can have mutual credit currencies, which are about labor or services, but we can have fish coin, solar coin, mangrove coin. And so these are thermodynamically informed currencies. So for example, fish coin, when I looked into it, I don't know how successful they are with this, but the project is, let's count how many fish we can fish without, exhausting the fish stock. So letting them, reproduce, which is not the case today. And so we'll give the fishermen only the amount of fish coins that represent that volume of fish, right? And so this is more generally called now global thresholds and allocations approach. And there are 2 or 3 projects which I really think are very important, like r30.org, Musiasem, I forgot the third one, but so these are projects that say, okay, let's see what we have. So 130 commodities, the Mendeleev scale and all of that, right? And for each commodity, we can say, like, historically, what is the progress of productivity? 2% a year, whatever. What is the biocircularity? So if you reuse it like copper, only 70% is still usable. How much do we find each year? What's the curve of finding these things? And so you calculate the negative pivots, like 50%, right? So the first 50% are easy to mine. Once you reach the peak, the second half becomes more and more expensive because it's deeper and deeper, rarer and rarer. Okay, so you count the global thresholds, and that gives you the allocations. Now, obviously, politically, we're not ready for this. But imagine after some serious trade wars and the cost of it is so bad that we say, well, we got to find some agreement amongst ourselves that we don't overuse and that we don't fight for it, right? We make an agreement. So at that moment, these things will come in as, and this is my subject, mutual coordination economics, right? So I believe we're shifting from these blind capitalistic accounting systems that only see themselves. And this is true for both markets and states, right? Enterprises look for themselves and states there's no obligation for a nation state to care for the planet legally. None. So we need new types of institutions, which I think can be translocal, that can be responsible for certain domains and for the protection of certain domains. And I call this magisteria of the commons. They don't exist yet, but the seed forms are there already. Does that make sense? Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's great. But in a certain way, at least in certain situations, doesn't the market mechanism create this by itself with the offer and demand and the fact that
Yes.
if a resource is harder and harder to get, it will get
Yes,
more and
that's
more
the
expensive?
argument, but there, there's some Japanese paper that's very famous for showing that doesn't work. It's always too late.
Yes, yeah.
It's always too late. And so the argument, so that depends if you're pro-market, that's the argument used. But the people who are critical of the market would say, no, that doesn't work. Actually, it doesn't work.
Yeah,
and
so the
and
idea
we
would be
have
to put a threshold in advance to
yes,
avoid this.
yeah. And so this is a mixing, right? We're not saying in this case like there's no market. It's so here's what I want to. So this is the other thing that we use, the hypothesis. So what is the pulsation of the commons? So if you look at cycles, right? So societies, civilizations, and have an ascending cycle, a peak, a descending cycle, which is, in my view, very well documented both by macro historians, world systems analysis. I mean, there's a very good empirical basis to see that these cycles exist. At least that's my view. And I did quite a bit of reading about them. So markets and states are extractive institutions, right? They compete. They have to grow, conquer. So in the ascending phase, obviously they work well because they are they're instruments of expansion. They soak up the surplus from somewhere, to be from labor or from another country or from nature. So they soak up the surplus, and so they expand by extracting this surplus until at some moment the cost of that extraction is no longer economical, or there's too much demand for redistribution, and that makes it so there's various reasons that can happen. So then when you enter in this sending cycle, the commons come back, because then you have, so when the population is fed and has social security and welfare, panem et circenses, nothing new. So the Greeks had it and the Romans had it, the welfare state. When it works, fine, right? But when you start starving bit by bit, or the middle classes disappears, then you start thinking like, wow, I can't trust these institutions anymore, right? And then you have the commons come back. So the commons are counter-cyclical to these cycles. So that's my theory. And if you want to find empirical evidence, so mainly one book that I recommend, it's called Ecological Revolutions from Mark Whitaker. And he shows ancient China, medieval Japan, and post-Roman Europe. And he really shows how this dynamic functions. I'm convinced. So it's after reading that book that I thought, oh wow, this is the other side of the cycle that nobody talks about. How the people react to the challenges that decline poses for them. Yes. And actually, sorry, do you have like water or something? Because I'm getting a bit, yeah. Okay, sorry to, yeah. Even from like public water is good for me, as long as there is a container. Yeah.
I was thinking about this idea of fish coin, and I think it was a few years ago that I was reading about the state of water shortage in the Middle East. So, for example, in Syria, Iran, Iraq, and all these basically places that are also struggling with political instability. And one of the fears I have when thinking about these places with the already basically chaotic governments is this idea of what happens if these resources, like fundamental resources like water, become so rare, then now there are some problems with like ideological groups. There would be emergence of people that would rebel just for natural resources. I was wondering if there are any studies, or you can share your thoughts about how these coins can actually actually counteract what governments are failing. I just add also another example that I read a few months ago on that already in Mexico, the drug cartels, realizing that water is kind of like becoming
Right.
a scarce resource. So they have started water cartels. So this is kind of like, I'm thinking part of this challenge of using these coins or tokens or thermodynamically shared tokens is not just a resource, but also the governments, the political basically leadership that doesn't stand to it.
So I mean, like really very recently, I haven't looked at these things. This is something I wrote in 2018. I'm kind of studying other things right now, but historically, I'll just give you a little story, just to illustrate how the pulsation works. So you have in 16th century Japan, you have 100 years of civil war, um, and there is a church. It's called the Pure Land Buddhist Church, and they have like 30-40% of the land. They're armed monks. They protect the people, and they have literally commons. So you look at their charters, it's like almost like Ostrom would have written them. Like they really illustrate, because heavy punishments. Like if you use more wood than you're allowed to, and don't forget this, in this period, wood is the thing, right? Like the energy is wood. There's nothing else. And most civilizations at that time overused their woods, and that's why they collapsed. Like the Chinese, Manchurians, sure there's Manchurians, but like at about the same time in China, you have a collapse of the empire because he had sent all these fleets out and he had deforested Manchuria. Okay, now I remember where Manchuria comes from, and so then you have people revolt, right? So in Japan, the people through that church had revolted against the feudal warlords, and they protected themselves for a while, right? But as soon as the shogun, uh, won the civil war, then of course all the warlords were united under his leadership. And the first thing he did, of course, was to attack the monks, disarm them, and take back that land. But he imperialized it. In other words, he actually kept the rules, and they became imperial domains. And what's so interesting in this case is that for 3 centuries almost, Japan was thermodynamically in balance. So they had a stable population. Wood use was heavily regulated. A new religion was introduced, Zen, to pacify the warriors. So they didn't fight anymore. They meditated instead because they had nothing to do. And a bit like Louis XIV, he forced the nobles to come every 2 years, and he forbade wheels, so they had to pay people to carry bags. I mean, this guy was clever. So there was a whole system that really worked for 2.5 centuries and kept, Japan civilized and at the same time, thermodynamically stable. So this is a good example. I mean, we may not like the way they did it because there was a lot of child killing involved, right? You could only have 2 children, and then surplus children had to disappear. So it's not exactly something we would like to do in the same way today. But it's interesting to see that a civilized entity was actually able to do that. But then, of course, the Europeans came. Was it the Americans with that boat? And then the Japanese realized, oh, if we don't become technical again, we will never be able to defend us. And then you have the Meiji Revolution. But it's a very interesting dynamic. Yes.
Yes, and so that's very interesting what you say at the end also, because I would like to challenge the goal of being thermodynamically stable at least in the very long term, because the story of evolution is also a thermodynamic story of finding new energy source, new energy gradients to exploit, and therefore to develop towards higher possibilities. And
yes, this of course in this environment is this yeah, of course, yeah.
No, but I know,
get that, yes.
I'm aware that it goes against the whole sustainability worldview, but I mean, that's also why I personally have my reservations, is that it's overlooks the importance of this competition towards getting resources and energy, and that sometimes, yes, if you just aim to be dynamically stable forever, you will eventually get outcompeted. So you need innovation also. And
yes. Yes. It's a good point. And you know, I don't exactly know how to combine both, because I think we need both. Yes, go ahead.
There is always an ingredient of something which is immaterial, like intelligence, inventiveness, that needs also to be calculated into this. And I can see, just in response to what Clement is saying, I believe that mathematically it's possible to have a system which is on the short term is stable, but on the longer term it is growing.
Yes.
And this has to do always with surplus, because at every situation there is a certain surplus that can be invested into exploration, inventiveness, etc. It cannot be calculated in terms of material resources, etc. So I think this is quite possible, but it needs some.
Yeah, actually, we have an example of this. So yeah, go ahead, Martha, go ahead.
Yeah, I would also want to ask, like, from the other side, that you kind of like cast this mutuality as the good guy thermodynamically, yes, and I wonder, like, is it possible that like really a setup following the mutuality kind of principles will actually become like a bad guy in terms of sustainability?
Yes,
yeah?
actually, that's the story I want to tell. So okay, so you have the cycles, but sometimes you have dark ages, right? And they're quite well documented now, so we know exactly when they occur and etc. So I believe in a dark age, there's something that emerges, which are so Carol Quigley, in his book The Evolution of Civilization, he talks about something I think is very important. He calls it instruments of expansion. So to have a civilization, you have to have an instrument of expansion that is able to extract a surplus and invest in its own growth. So he says in Europe, we had three of them: feudalism, commercial capitalism, and industrial capitalism. But then they become an institution and they start working only for themselves, right? And then they become dysfunctional for the society, and the society stops growing. And then you get chivalry, that's his language. You know, they basically have nothing to do, and so they play these games, right? For status. Mercantilism, so the state abuses commercial capitalism in a way, and monopoly capitalism. Okay, so that's the way he sees it. So and then it occurred to me that aren't there commons-based instruments of expansion? And I said, yes, of course, the monks. Because think about this. So first you have the military monks. No, it's not a nice topic, but you know, the Cossacks were, I didn't know this, I learned this from Toynbee, the Cossacks were a military congregation. A bit like the Jews today, like the Hasidic Jews, they have families, but they have like a certain organization of their life around the sacred. And you know, and they're warriors, they're like sacred warriors. So it's because they learned to defend the rivers, and they were able to stop the Mongols. That created Russia, right? So Russia, thanks its existence, its stability, because the Cossacks were able to stop the Mongols, and so stop that kind of dynamic between civilization and nomadics that, you know, kept just, you know, the Huns and, you know, the Visigoths and all of that, right? So they stopped that. So once you have secure a land for civilization, then you have the Benedictines and the Cistercians. So I read about the story of Saint Benedict. So, you know, he was a prefect of Rome, was tired of, you know, the decline of the Roman Empire. So he left, became a monk. But they called him back, and then he created the Benedictine order. And so the situation was that Italy was no longer producing food. The food came from Egypt. When it collapsed, it had no food because in Italy itself, they were making wine and olives with slaves. So in 50 years, the Benedictine order succeeded in recreating the whole food system for Italy. And that is a commons-based instrument of expansion because it answers your question. It's a system that constantly reinvests in its infrastructure and its own expansion, right? And they did it virally. So when they reached a certain level, they had to split in two like these, and then the other half of the monks had to find another place. You look at the maps, it's just unbelievable. Like thousands of monasteries in like 50 years. And then the Sister Seniors did the same thing for Europe in 975. And this is a very interesting story, I feel. So there's a book by Richard Moore. It's called The First European Revolution, 975, 1075. So okay, the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire falls in the 5th century, but the actual system continues to work for another 2-3 centuries. It's called late antiquity. So in other words, you don't have Rome, but you still have Roman soldiers in Gaul. They still have their Roman thing, and they still have a Roman general, and they make agreements with the Germanic invaders, etc., etc. But in the 8th century, when the Muslims invade North Africa, the West loses its mastery of the seas, and so there's no more commerce. So the real implosion of Europe is actually the 8th century, Western Europe. So 8th century, everything implodes. Charlemagne has no ships, so they cannot themselves against the Vikings from the north. The Moors come to 80 kilometers south of Paris. The Avars come from the east. And so the monks of Cluny, which I think are Benedictines at that time, they actually lead a social revolt. So Holy Mary in front, the farmers in the back, and they start confronting the proto-feudals with their sins, so raping women, stealing gold from the church. So and out of that comes a social revolution called the Peace of God movement. And so within decades, 600 or more cities signed these agreements. So one, make love not war. So the aristocratic families promised to expand through marriage, not through violence. Primogeniture, the oldest son gets everything. So there's pacification within the family. Unfortunately, the price to be paid by the commoners is they lose the right to hunt. So hunt becomes a monopoly of the feudal class. But it works. So it creates peace. And so then we have 3 centuries of growth. And then the Sister Seniors come in and they do the same thing as the Benedictines. And they create so much surplus that they recreate the cities, and then the guilds take over. And the guilds are also a mutualized institution. So I just want to tell you that story to show that the commons can be very efficient on the condition that that's, I think what you said is so interesting. It's that they have the surplus, right? So if you're too egalitarian and you just, spread it out equally to everybody, you're not building anything. You're maintaining status quo. If you want to grow, you have to stop your immediate desire, invest in the future. And so they were very efficient in doing that because there's no ruling class privately appropriating and buying cruise ships. And no, all the money or whatever, all the resources go in growing the system. So that's a commons-based instrument of an expansion. So let me now shift to my theory of open source and crypto, because I think there's something there. So what did open source achieve for me is the mutual coordination of labor at a global scale. So suddenly we have a technology, open ecosystems of contributions that allow anyone to say, I want to do this. And people around the world translocally can join that project and make a knowledge commons, a software commons, a design commons. That wasn't possible before. It was possible privately through multinationals, but it wasn't possible from the bottom up. Yes.
But these examples are in the information non-rival space. So I guess you will get to how this can be extended to material world and real world.
Yes. So here's the thing. Okay. So open source achieved the mutual coordination of labor at a translocal scale. But with the remaining economic issue that the commons work wasn't well funded. And so the result is that multinational companies tend to take over or at least have an oversized influence like IBM and Red Hat in Linux, for example. Okay, so the open source communities do have, methods to moderate that, but still, it's a real issue. And so my belief is that that is what crypto solves. So crypto creates the infrastructure to finance that labor. So typically when it was still legal, I'm not sure how they do it today, but when you had the token ICOs, right? So they would keep 40% of the tokens for labor. I don't think any Marxist revolution ever achieved that. Of course, there's a special kind of labor, labor aristocracy, but they did that, right? And so that's in itself is amazing because that means that so they're community oriented, they're open source, and they have a financial system to boot. And of course, I'm well aware of the speculative, abuse of all these things at the same time. But there's a core there that I think is very interesting. And precisely because, crypto has imploded from 3 trillion to 1 trillion, the people who are now in there still, they're not in there purely for the money. They are the true believers. So there's also a bit of a religious thing in a way, because you have to believe in that infrastructure. And so recently they even they improved their mechanisms because now they can fund public goods, right? So the public goods is because they read Sam Wilson and they only read Austrian economics and computer engineering and game theory. That's the world that they live in. But public goods, like the Ethereum Foundation alone has invested $80 million in public goods just in 1 year. And I'm friends with Scott Moore from Gitcoin. I think they did like 50 million of it. So I give you an example. You probably know this. I'm not very technical. Optimism is one of these. So if you want to send money through the blockchain, it's very slow. Then you have to pay a gas fee, and the more you pay, the faster it goes, right? And so now they're building extra channels, tubes, let's say, or at least virtual tubes, where it goes faster. So apparently optimism needs like 1.5% gas fee to maintain and grow its infrastructure. But they ask you for 3%. And where does the money go? To Gitcoin. I think that is really interesting because now we have, and think about it. So collective action problem, only the state could do it, right? But now the networks can do it. So the networks are creating their own common infrastructure. So I wrote this provocative editorial about Ron Paul Maoism. And I'm asking my libertarian friends, why are the crypto libertarians carrying out the program of Karl Marx? Because remember what Marx said, socialism, right, is when you still have scarcity, but no exploitation. So you have fair distribution, but there's still the law of value still operating. And only through functional equivalence, right? So as you grow civil society autonomously, and people get better educated and more technically capable, so civil society creates its own infrastructure that one day, and then he says that the state will die out, right? And then you have abundance. And that is what they're doing. Somewhat provocatively, that's my argument. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, thanks for doing this seminar. It's been really insightful so far. And I wanted to raise the question because you began to talk about it a little bit, but it kind of deals with this idea of labor and how this new kind of accounting system would kind of force us or allow us to imagine different kinds of labor and different. I'm curious in your mind, like what these new models of labor might be, or kind of like how it kind of forces us to reimagine the kind of work that we do within communities or within certain organizations. So yeah, I'm curious how you think about labor being transformed more generally on like
So there's a few things to
the different kinds of labor.
Thank you. Thank you. So a few things to say about it. So, and of course, the first thing that I noticed when I was studying open source like 20 years ago was, of course, was the passionate element, right? So in other words, you don't look for a job and then you do open source. You first do open source and then hopefully, you know, it creates a market of added value service around it. And then, so there is a passionate engagement. And why is it so important? Because we didn't have that before. Like if you study capitalist enterprise, only 1 out of 5 people would do the same if they were not paid. So people are there because they get paid, not because they necessarily. And so you have to be very lucky to get paid to do something that you like to do. Most people don't have that privilege. But if you look at Wikipedia, whether you like Wikipedia or not, but at least theoretically, 100% of people doing that are there because they want to do that. So that's already a big change. So the passion comes first, right? And so you have a filtering of passion, and so that's highly productive. The second thing is, I think the very notion of jobs may disappear. It's all about tasks. So you go from a division of labor, in my view, to a distribution of tasks. And so, you know, I'm not a technical expert, but I live in Chiang Mai where there are a lot of crypto nomads, and I work for a crypto nomadic entity called the Global Chinese Commons. So they're my employer. And so not Jinping, just stress. So these are Chinese people who want to do crypto, which is not very legal in China. So they move out and they do their crypto work outside, and they can go back to their families. And so they have this nomadic life. And you know, it's yeah, it's bounties, it's all kinds of stuff, but including I think that's a really interesting innovation I haven't studied yet, but what they now call retroactive public goods funding, right? So it's because you don't know beforehand what will be useful for a network, but once you recognize is that, oh wow, this is great, then you can direct funds to it. And that is interesting, but it preserves the passionate element. You know, people are still mostly doing it because they believe in it, right? So one system that I recommend you look into is Sensorica. They call it open value accounting. They've been doing this for 10 years. So in terms of like contributory accounting, this is the most sophisticated system that there is out there. And they've just been chosen by Gitcoin to lead the new funding round, which brings me to your question. So my critique of crypto until now, so you have the coordination of labor, you have the coordination of the financing of labor, but there's still no connection with real production. That is absolutely true. And the people who do the real production, so these urban commoners that are mutualizing provisioning system in the cities, they don't use crypto. But my fear is that because of that, the urban commoners are sublinear, right? They're not very productive because they lose an enormous amount of energy in processing, in making agreements. And so this is my dream. I don't know if it will work, but this is what I've tried to influence these networks with my work, is to say, you got to shift to production. You got to link crypto to these mutual urban provisioning systems, or rural or bi-regional. And so it's only when we have that we actually will have like a real answer, like let's say a post-capitalism that works. And notice when you say post-capitalism, you don't say anti-capitalism, right? It's like it integrates the best of the markets and state functions, but at a higher level of integration, which allows for more freedom of choice. So the way I see this, you have 3 levels. The basic level is mutual coordination. What needs to be done, I can see it, so I do it or not, and I'm eventually incentivized to do it. The second level is regenerative markets, so programmable currencies that are thermodynamically informed and can, like the fish coin, can, you know, infuse more equity or whatever you want to call it in the market. Then, so it makes the market smarter because you can see impact, you can see contribution, and you can take that into account. But the third level would be, and you know, this is like a coercive level, but this is like the protection of the planet. So here's why I see it like the the ability to see directly flows of matter and energy. So context-based sustainability, in any point of the network, you can see whether you are respecting the planetary boundaries and the resource limitations. So I think that is my end game, right? To have this kind of integrated global system. And so I talk about cosmo-local. And so the basic rule is if it's heavy, it's local. It makes more sense to do it local. 2/3 of our expenditure now is transport. So we spend 2/3 of matter and energy to transport and 1/3 of production, which is enormous. Then mutualization itself also saves a lot of matter energy. But then the learning has to be global, right? Any innovation that creates more sustainability has to spread in the network everywhere. And that's why you need global commons. So that's kind of the way, you know, that was a theme, mutual coordination economics. So that's what I'm thinking and writing about. How can we get there, right? And then we would have, in my view, a new type of civilization, which would have integrated the trans-local element. Because until now we've been geographic, and we had faster and faster communication. So there's this book, Harold Innis, Empire and Communication. He describes how every empire was more productive, communicatively productive than the previous one, right? But it was all about being fast, faster planes, faster trains, faster postal service. Now we have the trans-local, instantaneous, real-time collaboration at the trans-geographic level. And so I think cosmo-localism is kind of like the guiding principle of the new civilizational form. And the fourth sector, which Michel is working on at the university level, so how to do that for universities, is like for me the next organizational paradigm. Anyway, yes, I think you had a question.
Yes, I do I need to push button or is it? Yes, it's great. Because when you were talking about the suboptimal
Sublinear. Yes.
Sublinear in the urban commons.
Yeah.
And so this, I was wondering, so I get where you're going to with cosmology, because that I fully understand, but I was wondering, our friends at the Region Network, they are, do I understand right that they are trying to create that connection, or can you elaborate a little bit about how you see them trying to?
You mean Regions Unite or?
Yeah, where you were yesterday.
Yeah, actually, I don't know. I don't really know what they're doing. Sorry. I learned about it yesterday.
We had with
yes.
Is actually the Web3 people,
Yes,
so
yes.
the tech people, but they connected them with the local communities, so
Yeah.
the social workers.
Yes.
I was, because if you're talking about that, it sounds
So the vision,
like what they are doing.
the vision of Xavier, who is the creator of this. You know, and by the way, my Chinese friends think the same. So I thought, wow, this is so obviously my Chinese friends, you know, they want more freedom, and so they're thinking about cities. They told me, we believe that the future of China will be a China of cities. And okay, you know, was interesting. I didn't much see how they would do it yet, but then Xavier. So I'm really quite pessimistic about Europe, to be honest. You know, I live outside, of course, so I don't see everything, but it doesn't look too good from the outside. And Xavier was saying that, okay, if the US collapses, they have 40 cities and they're not well connected. So in other words, US is primed for civil war and for like regional breakup. But Europe has 400 cities that are very well connected and which huge amounts of land which has been abandoned in the last 50 years, which is which is there for agriculture revival. And I thought that was an interesting vision, right? That the cities could be the locus. And so this is another, so there was this very interesting network and they kind of disappeared. So they were called Las Indias, maybe you met them. And so David Ugarte, Natalia Fernandez, I think her name was, and then a Basque guy, Urrutia, they have one book about the history of markets, one book about the history of networks, and one book about the history of states. And they had a very interesting notion called Neo-Venetianism, right? And the idea is that at the time of these Italian city-states, the key thing was trust. First community and then commerce. So they would organize translocally already, and they had halfway houses everywhere. So that if you were part of a Venetian guild, you could basically go in the whole Mediterranean and you'd find like a kind of lodge that you could go to, and you would have a bed and a bar and food and so that okay. And now crypto is a bit weird because they talk about trustlessness, right? And so I think they're fighting between these two sides of their psyche. So it doesn't help that they're all computer engineers. Sorry for the computer engineers, that they only know Austrian economics. They think that's the only economics that is valid, and that they only study game theory, but they only study competitive game theory. They've never heard about cooperative game theory. Just don't know what it is, right? And this is difficult because when you talk with them, and I spend a lot of time with them now. I went to Montenegro, Zuzalu. It's like a self-organized pop-up academy, and then I went to Istanbul, and they're really focused, in my way too much on technology, right? So they would tell you stories. Oh, I managed 800 million, and we're fighting all the time, and people are, maneuvering to get the funding, and they know how to abuse the token system. And I said, well, have you ever heard of, sociocracy, holocracy? They're not interested. They want a new smart contract. And so that's a weakness. They're very techno-solutionist, very libertarian. So there's a lot of things they don't see. But at the same time, they also know that they need kinship. So they are organizing all these festivals and events. Like I live in Chiang Mai, which is like the world capital of crypto nomadic people. There's 35 million digital nomads today and 5 million people with wallets. And a lot of them are where I live. Like I literally have festivals every 2 weeks. Uh, it's getting tiresome. But yes, they like to party. And so there's this concept which I really think is interesting. This is from Jordan Hall. He talks about civium, right? So Geoffrey West, the book Scale, which talks about sublinear and superlinear development. So cities are superlinear, but his argument, and I think that's correct, is that the digital can compensate, can create another kind of very dense type of relationships that also innovates. And in that case, we wouldn't need to all live in these mega cities anymore. We could, spread out more and have better lifestyles and actually revive the countryside because we wouldn't be that isolated. But we would still meet, right? So remember the Middle Ages, we had the RAS and these trade fairs, right? And it's really weird, but that's what the crypto communities are doing. They're creating their own system of like permanent gatherings where they meet, where they talk, where they learn from each other. And that's very interesting to see. So they kind of also know to compensate, high tech with high touch, right? They don't ideologize politics, but human beings, and so they actually do it anyways. It's probably under theorized in their way, but kind of anthropologically interesting to see that. And there is, of course, like a more progressive wing, Crypto Commons Alliance, the blockchain socialists. There's a whole like left that is in there as well, and that tries to kind of, move the needle to more social awareness and yeah. Yeah, okay. I think I pretty much said what I wanted to say. So I don't know how much I spoke, but yeah. But that's the basic story I wanted to share with you.
So maybe let's start from the Zoom. Does anybody have comments, questions, something to share? People on Zoom, are you there? Yeah, okay.
Yes. Hi, Michael. I want to ask a question. Uh, you mentioned a lot about network, and I was thinking about how a network overall it evolves. And I was thinking like, what are your views about relationship strength between some nodes? Because maybe there are some centers in the network, and there are some relationships that actually play a very prominent role. And these relationships can actually take the network overall evolution in a direction which is not uh, good when we talk about global commons. So I understand we can think of some centers where we get good results. And I think Ostrom also talks about it when she says that uh, that the ideas can work in local context, but don't try to think about the overall global context, because then I think she recognizes that it's going to fail because the action situation changes. So yeah, I want to hear your views about this idea.
Yeah, so I don't know if you know Primavera de Filippi. She just produced like 3 really important documents that synthesizes a lot of knowledge about network governance and polycentricity, and actually how it works specifically in the blockchain. I was just reading it before I came back to Belgium, and so she's very clear about that. There are really like different stakeholders, and they all have their own interests. And the token holders, they can be like speculative investors, right? But if nobody contributes, that's not good for them either. And also the contributors, they don't want to be dominated by money. So that's why like quadratic voting and quadratic funding and all these innovations, in my view, they are anti-oligarchic measures, right? It's part of the struggle between these different forces with the network that are trying to preserve their interest in the broader network. And if you look at the medieval city-states that in Europe, and that might be true elsewhere, I haven't studied it elsewhere, but the guilds, right? The guilds were also collaborating and competing with each other. And then they had all these rules to avoid oligarchization. Eventually, they would lose that struggle. But, I remember going to Dubrovnik where the mayor, as soon as he was elected, he was imprisoned. So that anybody who would want to talk to him would have to register. And that was against lobbying, right? In other cities, the city would buy the grain at a fixed price until 5 p.m. And there were masked people from other cities, so they wouldn't have too many feelings. They had the right to execute speculators. I'm just saying, so so this kind of equality was very well defended for a long time, and eventually, money overwhelmed them anyways. But that is at this stage happening in crypto, and my feeling is that the pendulum is swinging at it swung to speculation and oligarchy for a while, but now it's swinging back. And I'm quite happy to see, the kind of self-awareness that these coders have in terms of like protecting their interests as, as a labor group, right? Like we're the ones making it happen. You have to treat us well or we're going somewhere else. And so this is something I want to tell you also. Kojin Karatani wrote a very interesting book called Isonomia. And he says Greek democracy wasn't invented in Athens. It was invented in the Ionian coast where they had freedom of movement. So all these cities were actually competing So in other words, they had forking. So because they had a right to exit, these cities had to actually have sound democracies to attract creative people to their city. I think that's a very interesting analogy with what crypto communities are trying to do. They're trying to be attractive to coders and that keeps them on their toes.
Can you tell me that paper again, the cryptocurrency which connects it with polycentricity? Yeah.
I don't know the exact title, but it's Primavera, and it's about blockchain governance.
Oh, okay. Blockchain governance. Okay.
2004 at Gmail. And if you write to me, Michel, SUB 2004 at Gmail. And if you write to me, I can find it. I have it somewhere in my bookmarks.
Okay. Thank you.
Here we have a question from Harry. He is giving you a menu of choices. How do we go to the holocratic global commons? Do you see it happening via some major collapse and governance reform, government reforms, or insurrection?
Yeah, I mean, I'm the one that asked this question. I just would like to know Michel's take on it because it's a great vision, but how do we do the transition?
Right. Yes, it's a good question, and I am on the pessimistic side, to be honest. So I believe in seed forms. So you have a particular system with its paradigms and rules, which worked to solve certain issues at some time ago, and then it grows, it reaches a peak, and then it's declining, and it's no longer able to solve these issues with that paradigm. So at that time, you have exodus. So in other words, pioneers with anticipatory consciousness, right? They feel before other people that this is not working, so they leave the system and they experiment with seed forms. And of course, not all these seed forms will work, but some of them will. So think about purgatory as a hack to allow Christians to lend money. So before that you would go to hell if you would lend money as a Christian. So that created the possibility for the bourgeoisie to do their business. Then the printing press, right, which creates the capacity to duplicate ideas and spread them much more faster than the scribal bureaucracy of the church could control it. Then you have double entry book accounting. So these are seed forms that eventually create capitalism, but not immediately. So the feudalism has to really enter into crisis in the 14th century before people say, oh, we need to shift to something better or different and see if that works for us. So I believe in these seed forms, as creating attractors that, as the situation declines, are already there. So I remember the story of Alaric, one of these Visigoth kings that ruled Italy for a while. And there were 300,000 people left in Rome. I'm not sure about all the details, but anyway, so he decided to destroy the aqueducts to force people to leave the city, and then only 80,000 were left at some point. And so where did people go? Well, it just happened that the monks had already been working for 150 years, and so so there were places where you could go. You could go around and then you became some kind of dependent of the monastery, but you had a place to go, right? And I think this is what we're doing now. We're creating seed forms, and you could see crypto as a resilience game, right? A bit selfish, like, okay, I'm an educated coder, and if Portugal collapses, I'll just go to Greece. If Greece collapses, I'll go to Chiang Mai. If Chiang Mai collapses, I'll go. Okay, quite selfish, but you can't blame people, to protect themselves and to look for solutions in a society that is going into more and more difficulty. Now, my argument, of course, would be that if you do that, at some point they'll come at you with pitchforks anyway. So you should, if you're smart enough, you should actually not be a nowhere, but you should be an everywhere, right? So play the role of these guilds in the Middle Ages that were traveling and sharing their knowledge in the different localities. And I actually think that the European Middle Ages are a very interesting example. So very distributed, a lot of local democracy. 98% of the urban population was in associations. So they had their own welfare and solidarity systems. And at the same time, they had some kind of ideological unity, so that intellectual class, had space. You look at the biographies of all these people, and they moved around. They, worked for the Duke of this and the Count of that and the King of this. So the clerical class in the Middle Ages was moving, just as these codas are moving. But I think they should. So if we ideally, what I see is this combination of local mutualized solutions for real problems like cooperative housing, getting organic food, renewable energy, all the things that we need. But then these experts in technology and protocols that can then basically, enrich the local and share their knowledge and then learn from one place, eventually go another place. You know what I mean? Where they then can also share what they learned from this place. So that's kind of what I see. Might be idealistic. So yeah, of course, there could be revolution. There could also be like Reformation. Rome was almost died in the 1st century. And then they had some clever emperors, the Diocletians, that gave it a new life for 2 centuries. So, I'm not, you don't have to be too deterministic. We don't really know exactly when things will turn very sour, and it is non-linear. So, we cannot assume that this is just like a slow, we don't really know how exactly this is going to play out. But I think it's a good insurance for anybody to start looking at those solutions. That if something happens and the state does not provide you what you need, your pension is too low to survive, what you do. And the answer is you need to common again. It's the only way to survive.
What do you think is the role of reputation systems, just in the light of what you are describing?
I'm a bit skeptical because so far I don't see them working very well. I think the human touch is still what it's about. And so all these crypto communities talk about trustlessness all the time, but it's still really do we know you? For example, you want Gitcoin money. It's very hard to do, because people need to vote for you. Are they going to vote for you if you don't know anyone in the network? No. So that's one of the critiques outsiders have, against Gitcoin funding, is that how do we get in? It's very complicated. It's has a high level of complexity. So it is an elite group. It is an in-group. You can get in. It's just that, and if you don't go to Zuzalu, nobody knows you, right? So you need to also be there and be seen and be known and so I don't know if a formal reputation system can I'm quite skeptical about it.
Yeah, just a side remark, but what you're describing is a reputation system. That if you need to have the reputation of being voted for to be able to.
Yes, but it's not formal, right? It's an informal one. It's the formal only works if you are informal first, because then you get to know all the little things that you need to do to actually get the money. It's not always obvious.
So
I know this from experience because I tried to have something funded, and there's a little thing that we missed, and we didn't we didn't even get in the competition, right? So it was not obvious at all what that thing was.
So my question So I just checked the CoinMarketCap website. There's more than 8,000 different cryptocurrencies right now. What do you think about the energetic impacts that it has to create all these blockchains? And we know that in 10, 20 years, there will be only a few leaders, probably.
Right.
So do you think it's a necessary evil to use a lot of energy right now to develop all these things, to try a diversity of them? Or do you think it could be improved already now that we should?
Yeah, I think there is improvement. So, for example, Ethereum moved from proof of work to proof of stake and saved 95% of its energy intake. So I think there is a growing awareness. You know, there's kind of a hardcore that doesn't care, but I think there are a lot of coders. You know, the regenerative part of the crypto world, you know, is also changing the mentality slowly and bringing this kind of awareness. So there's a lot of experimentation. I don't follow it too closely, but they are making real efforts to address these questions. Yes.
So what do you think should happen in terms of like having new kind of business models as opposed to just simple technocentric tokenomics that is so dominant? So what is that step or that paradigm that should take place? Because I actually was very, very into blockchain and also founded the company. And then I think one thing that really, I think disheartened me was this so-called trust and community that actually didn't exist. And it was all about actually the same narrative being put into a new bottle. So it was the same kind of, I think, philosophy that I saw. And I think still is I think the hope for blockchain, at least in my perspective, was to see some sort of business models that really see that human touch and that I think the value that this technology can bring to these complex challenges that we're facing. So I was wondering if you have any vision on that or any thoughts that you personally think should happen.
Well, you know, I think, I don't know, like I can't give really numbers to it, but I do think that most people in crypto are libertarians. And that means that formally they are for markets and they believe markets will solve everything. But there's also been like an undertow of a growing number of people who are much more environmentally and socially aware. And I'm lucky enough to work with those people. And so I can see that, you know, like my Chinese friends, they are very, very much into creating real trust, trying to do something with local communities where they're located. So I think it depends, you know, it's, I think, you know, sometimes when things go bad, that's good, right? Because the worst people are out. Those who wanted to get rich quick, you know, when it loses 2/3 of its value, I don't know where they are, but they're not there right now. And so the people who are still doing it are actually I think the better ones that believe in the project and that have some, you know, and of course they're idealists, but I think that's a good thing. You remember Viktor Frankl, right? When he writes about the concentration camp, he says only two kinds of people survived the evil because they could protect themselves outside of it. So the Catholics, because you know they could go vertical and believed in another world, and then the communists because they believed in the future, right? They kind of collapse the transcendence in time, and those two reactions, right, projected them outside of the suffering that they had to go through because they believed there was something else after, or at the same time, some, you know, in some other dimension, whatever, right? So the fact that crypto is also a belief, I think, is a good thing. You know, even if they're wrong, like we're communists right, we're Catholics right, I don't know, but I think we need something, right? We need to project our hopes and our energy. And, there's this kind of a study of like how long you live by profession. And in France, a very long study. And you know who lives the longest? The philosophy professors of the Sorbonne. And who lives the shortest? People who do a lot of sport. So it's mind over matter, right? So it's mind over matter. I don't say you shouldn't go to the gym, but if you do too much of it, it's actually not a good thing, apparently. Aha, right. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. I'm not surprised. So, that's what they found. They found that like hardcore sports people die 58, 62, heart too big, whatever, I don't know, but who? Oh, okay, that could be. Yeah. All right, that could be. Yeah. Yeah. I read that like a long time ago, but I took it as an excuse. Okay, I don't have to do sports. No.
I have a question. You mentioned a few times this issue of trust, which is really interesting. Do you have any thoughts how it can be scaled up? Because we know it can work in small communities, small circles of people that know each other, but the problem is scaling it up somehow,
Yes.
technologically or otherwise. Do you have any thoughts about it?
Well, so the advantage of, this kind of like digital scaling, like you could look at Linux and the average team is 4 or 5 people. So I think this is why it works. So you do have a massive system, but within it, you can actually create all these micro communities, and within the micro community there is trust. And then we have to find an appropriate way to link them. Do we know how to do this? I don't really know. I don't really think we really know how to do this. But a lot of people are working things out and trying things out. And I know it's controversial, but I like him, Matthias de Smet. Mass formation versus group formation, right? So when you feel anxious, like a lot of people today, you tend to go to mass formation. So look for people who think like you, and you reject people who don't think like you. And then he says the different thing is group formation. And this is working with people on something constructive and learning to dialogue with them, even though you don't share the same opinions, right? And this creates the real groups, not like masses that kind of mobilize and then like, dissolve. So I think this is now we are in an age where we actually need to go back and think about the end of Rome, the Stoics, the Epicureans. That was all about like going back to the garden. There was this kind of mentality as well, right? That when the whole system is kind of dissolving, you better know what people you can count on. And that's a complex dynamic, but I think that's a lot of people are looking for that now.
I wanted to add another kind of like point that kind of bothers me, and I very much like when you. I would like to underscore this what you said about existing things. There needs to be an existing infrastructure for commons, and I kind of like I
Yeah.
really like notice that, yes, because you see like many things that happen in our societies and economies are not existing, are projects in development, yes,
Right.
are ideas, we are building something together,
Yes.
yes, and it's very frustrating when you try to kind of like really collaborate in self-organizing. Let's include everybody's idea, like we are all kind of, mutuality and like in such circumstances, because some people get the idea, some people don't get the idea. Many people have different ideas, and in such situation, if it's, you know, like a simple thing, okay, let's play with colorful blocks, beautiful, like play, you know, but let's build something that is like basically like very convoluted in my mind, that I'm like now speaking, you know, I'm saying something, you hear something completely different, you know, from what I mean. And then you say, oh yeah, I will do that, you know, and then you do something different. Yeah? So this is where I, you know, this whole paradigm, which I love, you know, like thinking about like, okay, existing like Ostrom type of, you know, like we have experienced that, we have been living there 10 years, everybody has felt on their skin the consequences, we know what we are speaking about, yeah. But in those, like in the mind projects, we don't know what we are speaking about, because everybody has something different in the mind, yeah. So this is where like I kind of like, I want this paradigm, but then if I'm really into an idea, you know, it really annoys me, you know, this kind of, yeah. So
well, you know, I mean, you know, because of my age, but I'm also frustrated a lot by some of the current mentalities that we are facing, right? So, for example, some of the things that exhaust me is like processing people. That, you know, they just want to process emotions, beliefs, and they don't do anything. They're just like meeting and meeting and meeting. And one of the reasons I actually like open source, right, is because people actually do things. You know, it's probably, you know, it has other things that we don't like, but it's efficient. Despite all the waste, there's a lot of efficiency in there. And, you know, typically in a way, it fits our individualism, right? Because, you know, typically like left-wing people, and you know, I come from that milieu, it's like there's one right way to think about something. And then we fight about what that right way is, and then we split. And we spend a lot of time critiquing, discussing. Open source is another paradigm. There's very little discussion, right? You do it, and then it's kind of like a Darwinian process. And then you talk together only when there's a real conflict, right? So you don't need to make a lot of decisions, actually. Like you just do it, and you do it that way, and I do it that way. And eventually, like it gels that this is the best way to do it. Does that make sense? So one of the reasons I like open source and crypto is because there is this kind of like, we make it, we are actually making it, and you know, it has to work. Like if you, like we are sending people to the moon and they use Linux, you know, like it has to work, right? In Wikipedia, you can make a mistake, but not in these types of, so I think it's in its own way, it's an efficient way of producing things. Yes.
Yeah, sorry, I'm going back to the issue of trust, because I agree with you, it's a critical issue. And maybe to play a bit devil's advocate, in a capitalist system, it's simply the amount of money that you have that implicitly confers you trust, because if you have a lot of money, you can hire people, you can move matter, energy, you can process things, you can do things in the world.
Right.
So yeah, what do you think?
Well, I think this is very interesting, but okay. So I sometimes talk about the shift from Marxist capitalism to Proudhonian capitalism. So let's explain what I mean. You know, Marx believed that the surplus value comes from, you know, work, labor, right? The labor value theory. And Proudhon said, no. The productivity comes from putting people together and working together. So said you put 100 craftspeople together, they'll be more productive than if they work separately. So he thought that the surplus comes from cooperation. So now you look at Facebook, Uber, Google, what are they doing? They have very few people working for them on a wage, right? They are exploiting cooperation. They are creating fake peer-to-peer systems and fake commons in a way, right? And so they're no longer producing things that they sell. They're putting us together on an exchange system, and they ask us for money to do the exchange. So that's why Janusz Varoufakis, and I think he's right, he talks about techno-feudalism. Okay, I don't think he's completely right, because feudalism was a set of rights and obligations. And these companies have no obligations. They just take. Or they do build a platform, but you know, if you have any issue, try it. try to get hold of a human being. Impossible. So they are, I call them netarchical capitalism, the hierarchy of the network. So capitalism has changed from a commons destroying system to a commons exploiting system, right? Enclosures are the basis of capitalism. First, they destroyed the monasteries in the Reformation and took all, the goods of the the Catholic Church and sold it to the gentry. And then they enclosed the farmers in the 16th century. That's the basis of capitalism, privatizing the commons. The new capitalism, that's not what they're doing. They are, oh yeah, sure, share, use Uber, we don't need to make cars anymore. We don't need to make hotels anymore, right? What is Klaus Schwab? You'll own nothing and you'll be happy, right? So that's the new paradigm of it's a new kind of capitalism. But I think we shouldn't be pessimistic about this because we can do the same. So I talk about reverse co-optation. And I think crypto has been quite successful in doing that. So at the end of the Roman Empire, there's this guy called Boëtius who wrote The Consolation of Philosophy, right? He was like a prisoner of Theodoric. He had been like prime minister, and then he was accused of betraying his king to the Byzantium Empire. And so when he was in prison, he wrote that book, but he also funded, I think, maybe the first monastery, right? He says, okay, I'm going to die. I'm a Roman elite. I have all that money. So I'm going to fund a monastery where we can keep our culture, speak Latin, copy all the works that the Germanic warlords don't understand, and keep them alive for better times. And then what happened is that the Roman elite, which saw that things were not going in a good direction, they started investing in the monasteries. Like pray for me every year, and then it was their pension, right? So when they were old, they would become monks themselves, and they'll have an apartment and food and protection. And so I think capital nowadays is investing in crypto for that very reason also. Like the system is declining. Like, where is our money really safe? The state can take it from us. And so all that money flows in crypto. And then, if it works well, then that money is actually be used to create public goods. So I think this is actually a good thing, right? It's because if you're too idealistic about this, right, then you have nothing. So so to have a commons-based instrument of expansion, you need to find a way that a part of the elite starts funding you. And so I have this friend, Mark Whitaker, I mentioned his book, and I talk regularly to him. So he talks about jurisdictional alliances. The world changes because of changing jurisdictional alliances. Right. So what is the kind of social alliance that can promote a shift to the commons? What are the forces in a declining system? Because you always need elites, I think, personally. Even though I see myself being on left, I think we need elites. And there's a famous story about the Buddhist monks in India. So when the Mughals come, they kill all the monks. They either flee to Tibet or to the south. So when the Mughals weaken, Buddhism doesn't come back because they have, there's no more elites to reproduce that value system. And so Hinduism, that is still there because of the popular beliefs, then creates a new elite, right? So we need elites. It's never like a pure proletarian revolution. It's always a combination of, the productive classes and the managerial classes. I honestly don't know what it will be this time, but I think this is, what we have to sense where, where are the openings to fund more commons.
Yes, just another question. You mentioned just a few minutes ago that doing concrete things, concrete projects is kind of the connective tissue, a real connective tissue for self-organizing of commons, etc.
Yes.
Now, I was thinking that we are in the middle of the AI revolution, and it seems that in the coming years, less and less concrete work will need to be done by human agents. And I kind of speculate, imagine that the connective tissue will become something which is more like thinking together rather than working or doing things together. So I'm just curious, what do you think about it?
I think I can follow your reasoning, and I probably largely agree with it. So, if you think about civilization, what it does, right? It creates an elite. Like you invent writing, and then you have a surplus of agriculture, which funds the crafts, and then eventually you have enough funding to. So, but they didn't have enough energy, so they needed slaves. So to basically civilization for a long, long time needed slaves. Without slaves, there's not enough surplus to maintain that class, right? And I think capitalism has invented energy slaves, right? And there's people who calculate this. I forgot, it's like 1 to 600, or I know. So every human being today in the modern West has 600 slaves. Like we have the equivalent of 600 slaves to maintain our lifestyle. Yes, yes. I can't remember where I saw that. It could be 200, but yeah, it could. But it's it's substantial, right? Um, so I think the problem is not a problem of AI and productivity per se. Is the fact that capitalism is in charge of it. So in other words, we save labor and we are replaced, and the profit goes to one very small group of people. But then we are not getting money anymore, and so there's no consumers, right? So this is, I think, the fundamental issue. So I think productivity growth is not bad in itself, because maybe that's what we want. I mean, I am very happy, I'm very privileged that I'm getting paid to do what I really like to do. But how many people can say that? So if AI does the boring, stamping documents, even coding, although I've spoken to a few coders and they're very skeptical about it, but even that. But let's assume that it is happening, right? It's only good news if that frees us from doing boring work, but at the same time allows us to, move up. We can all be mystics and stuff like that, right? Or whatever it is that creates the passionate response. But that can only happen if we have commons property, in my view. Like if the profits are going in one way and unemployment goes the other way, then we have a fundamental problem. And so in the short term, that may be what happens before there's a reaction. So do you know Peter Turchin? Right? So his three criteria are wealth concentration, something with education, I'm not sure what that is, I forgot, and then poverty levels. So once you have 80% of the people who are no longer have a stake in the system, you have revolution mechanically, because he actually created a model, and he predicted a posteriori, but without programming it in, the French Revolution, the end of the Roman Empire. Like it really works. It's amazing. Wealth concentration, something with education, and then like the poverty levels. 80%. Yes. So when 80% of people no longer have a stake in the system, like they're too poor to care about the system. And then you get civil war, fragmentation, all this stuff. So, we are destroying the middle class. We are. It's yeah, we're not there yet. We're not, but I think you can feel that we are already quite far in the process. So yeah, there is a lot of speculation about civil war in the US. So the people who study civil war, like Bosnia, and they did models, and they would say the US is at 70%. Like if whatever their criteria are of what happens before you have civil war, then the US is quite advanced in that direction. It's also, ideology, right? The fact that we can no longer talk to each other, like the culture war. So 90% of people are okay now to marry somebody from another race. But the majority of Democrats and probably also Republicans do not want their children to marry somebody from the other side. Yeah. Yes. I personally think the culture war is it's a class war. It's the contemporary version of, and so you see in the Roman Empire, pagans versus Christians, the end of feudalism, Reformation and Catholics fight it out. And now it's, around identity and educated versus non-educated. So we are, I think, pretty advanced in the decline. But the positive side of it is that it stimulates counter-cyclical reaction. And so a way to remain hopeful, in my case, I need that. I can't live with like a totally dark vision, is to look at these seed forms. Now, is these seed forms grow tenfold in 10 years, which is what I saw in Ghent. And then I saw it in other countries about these urban commons. Then say, well, I will look at that. I'm not looking at the decline every day because what can I do about it? But if I look at the people who are actually changing things and I see them growing, that gives me hope, right? Not exactly for tomorrow, but then, if you can project your vision long enough, so you see the decline, but that's not the end of the story. There will be a new cycle eventually. And then, of course, you have different cycles of different lengths. So the cognitive cycle is only 50 years, right? So that's maybe in my lifetime. Then you have the generational cycle, which is 100 years. And the war cycle is 100 years. And the hegemony cycle is 100 years. Okay, too late for me. Then you have like 250, 500, 1,000 year cycles. It's, yeah.
So you are one of those who is projecting forward, not upwards, yes, in the situation.
Yeah, it doesn't quite work for me, but I wouldn't mind getting like the light of Damascus or anything like that, but it hasn't happened yet. But to be honest, I see a lot of my friends moving in a direction. There's an epidemic of Christian conversions in my circles. George Hall is becoming Christian. He's quite famous in my circles. There's a lot of people. Orthodoxy is doing very well. Catholics not so well, but there's a lot of people. And, new agey type of reactions. There's a lot of people busy with those things. Psychedelics, ayahuasca,
It works.
It's in the air. Yeah.
It's time for us to finish. The time slot is over. I meanwhile check the bar. It's open, so we have where to go.
Thank you to everyone, and also the Zoom people. Thank you for following us, and you're still quite a few there, so that's not too bad.
Yes. It was brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.